Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that might surprise you. What if the greatest mystery of ancient Egypt wasn't the pyramids themselves, but the ordinary men who built them? What if I told you these workers went on strike for beer, gossiped about their neighbors, sued each other in court, and left behind thousands of personal letters complaining about everything from lazy co-workers to difficult mothers-in-law? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious whether you're settling in for the night or listening during the day. If you've ever worked in construction or remember the labor movements of the 40s and 50s, I'd especially love to hear your thoughts on ancient workers' rights down below. Your generation lived through the formation of modern unions. You'll appreciate how little has changed in 3,000 years. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We've all seen the documentaries, the pharaohs in their golden masks, the pyramids rising impossibly from the desert, the mysterious hieroglyphs promising eternal life. But tonight, we're not talking about kings. We're talking about the men who made those kings' eternity possible, and whose own stories got buried under 3,000 years of sand, waiting for archaeologists to dig them up and realize something remarkable. These ancient workers left behind one of the most complete records of working-class life from any ancient civilization. Welcome to Deir el Medina, a purpose-built workers' village on the west bank of the Nile, across from ancient Thebes, modern Luxor. For nearly 500 years, from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, this isolated community housed the elite artisans, stonemasons, painters, and sculptors who carved and decorated the tombs in the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. And they didn't just build tombs, they left behind thousands of ostraca, pottery shards and limestone flakes used as scratch paper that documented everything from shopping lists to legal disputes to love poetry. Think about that for a moment. These weren't nobles. These weren't priests or scribes serving in the temples. These were craftsmen, working men. And yet they were literate enough to write letters, keep accounts, draft legal documents, and leave behind a paper trail that would make a modern bureaucrat proud. The result is something extraordinary. We know more about the daily lives of these workers than we know about the pharaohs they served. Tonight, we're going to step into their world. Not the grand monuments they created, but the cramped houses they lived in, the strikes they organized, the rations they fought over, the families they raised, the gossip they traded, the justice they demanded. These men built eternity for others, but they lived decidedly mortal lives themselves. And those lives, it turns out, look surprisingly familiar. Let's start with the basics. Deir el Medina wasn't some organic settlement that grew over centuries. It was planned, built specifically to house the workers who would serve the royal necropolis. And its location tells you everything you need to know about how the Egyptian government viewed these men. Valuable enough to deserve special housing and better rations than average Egyptians, but also potentially dangerous enough that they needed to be isolated and controlled. The village sits in a narrow desert valley on the west bank of the Nile, about 1 mile from the cultivated land and the river itself. Not prime real estate. The west was the land of the dead in Egyptian cosmology, which made sense for tomb workers, but it also meant they were physically separated from the main population centers. They couldn't just wander into Thebes on their days off. Getting to the village required a deliberate journey across the desert. The village wall wasn't decorative, it was functional. A stone barrier that enclosed roughly 70 houses at the settlement's peak, with one single main gate that could be guarded. Inside, The houses were packed together in rows along a main north-south street that the ancient residents called the Great Street. Narrow alleys branched off this main thoroughfare, creating a layout that was organized, efficient, and remarkably cramped. Picture this. You're living in a house that's maybe 10 feet wide and 50 feet deep, butted directly against your neighbor's wall on both sides. No windows except maybe one small opening near the roof for ventilation. Your front door opens directly onto a street barely wide enough for two people to pass. Privacy? That's a modern luxury. In Deir el-Medina, everybody knew everybody's business because the walls were thin and the houses were close and sound carried in the desert night. And yet, by ancient Egyptian standards, these were good accommodations. The houses were laid out in a standard pattern, a front room for receiving guests, maybe a middle room for living and cooking, and a back room for sleeping and storage. Some houses had a cellar dug into the rock beneath for storing grain and valuables. A few had a small walled yard at the back. The roofs were flat, made of wooden beams covered with packed mud, and served as extra living space where people could sleep during hot summer nights. The archaeological evidence shows us exactly how these houses were furnished, not lavishly, but adequately. Low wooden stools and headrests for sleeping, woven reed mats on the floors, pottery for storage, lots of pottery, because everything from grain to water to beer had to be stored in ceramic vessels, simple wooden chests for clothing and valuables, oil lamps for lighting, hearths for cooking, though most cooking seems to have been done outside in shared courtyards or on rooftops to avoid filling the house with smoke. Some houses show evidence of considerable wealth. Decorated walls, better furniture, more storage space. The community wasn't egalitarian. There were clear hierarchies based on skill, seniority, and position. The foreman lived in larger houses. Master craftsmen had more resources than apprentices. But compared to the mud huts that typical Egyptian farmers lived in, even the smallest house in Deir el-Medina represented a significant upgrade. Those of you who remember the housing boom after World War II might appreciate the concept. Purpose-built communities designed to house workers in a specific industry. The big difference is that Deir el-Medina's residents didn't get to choose their neighbors or move away easily. You were born into the community, trained in the family trade, married someone from the village, and raised your own children to follow the same path. It was a closed world, isolated by design. And that isolation was the point. These men knew the locations of royal tombs. They knew the secret entrances, the hidden chambers, the treasures being sealed inside. They knew which tombs had false doors and which had real treasures. They were, in modern terms, the ultimate security risk. The solution: keep them in one place where they could be watched, fed, and controlled. Give them better lives than they'd have anywhere else. But make sure they understood that those privileges came with strings attached. The villagers weren't prisoners exactly, but they weren't entirely free either. They worked in teams under strict supervision. Their rations were controlled by the state. Their movements were monitored, and if you caused too much trouble or were suspected of tomb robbery, the ultimate crime for a necropolis worker, the consequences were severe. Still, within these constraints, the people of Deir el-Medina built lives. They raised families, practiced trades, worshipped gods, settled disputes, and left behind a record of existence that's remarkably complete. When the French archaeologist Bernard Bruyère began systematic excavation of the site in 1922, he uncovered not just houses and tombs, but the intimate details of lives lived 3,000 years ago. Let's talk about who these people actually were. The village housed approximately 60 to 70 families at any given time during its 400-plus-year occupation. That translates to somewhere between 300 and 400 residents total, counting men, women, and children. Not a large community by any measure, but an exclusive one. The workforce itself was divided into two main gangs, the gang of the right and the gang of the left, named for the sides of the tomb they worked on. Each gang had its own foreman, deputy foreman, and hierarchy of craftsmen. At the peak, each gang contained about 60 workers, though numbers fluctuated based on the scale of the current project. These weren't unskilled laborers. That's the first misconception to clear up. The heavy stone moving, the quarrying, the brutal preliminary excavation work that was done by temporary workers, often conscripted peasants fulfilling their labor obligations to the state. The Deir el-Medina men were specialists. They were the surgeons of stonework, if you will. They came in after the rough work was done. The skill sets represented in the village were diverse and highly specialized. You had stonecutters who could work limestone and sandstone with remarkable precision, sculptors who carved the elaborate reliefs and statues, draftsmen who drew the preliminary outlines on the walls, getting proportions and perspective correct according to Egyptian artistic conventions, painters who ground pigments and applied colors that would last millennia, plasterers who prepared wall surfaces, even specialists in particular aspects. One man might be known as the best at carving hands, another at painting eyes, and then you had the support staff. Scribes who kept records of work done, materials used, and rations distributed. Water carriers who hauled precious water from the Nile across the desert to the work sites. Guards who protected the tombs during construction. Doorkeepers who controlled access to the work areas. It took a village, quite literally, to build a pharaoh's tomb. The training was generational. Sons learned their father's trades, apprenticing from childhood. By the time a boy was in his teens, he was working alongside the men, learning the techniques that had been passed down for centuries. This created family dynasties of craftsmen. The archaeological record shows families where 4 or 5 generations worked in the village, fathers teaching sons, teaching grandsons, each generation adding to the collective knowledge. But here's what made these men truly elite. Literacy. In ancient Egypt, maybe 1% of the population could read and write. Among the Deir el-Medina workforce, literacy rates were exceptionally high. Not universal, some workers never learned to read, but far above the general population. They needed to read architectural plans, understand written instructions, keep work records, and communicate with the scribes and overseers who managed the projects. This literacy is why we know so much about them. They wrote things down. Everything. Work logs documenting how many days each man worked and why some missed shifts. Letters to family members serving in other parts of Egypt. Legal documents recording marriages, divorces, property transfers. Complaints about lazy colleagues, requests for tools, shopping lists, medical prescriptions, even literature. Some ostraca contain copies of popular stories and poems. One famous ostracon is a letter from a foreman berating a worker for missing too many days. The foreman lists every excuse the worker gave. Your eye hurt, your mother was sick, you had to make bricks for the scribe, you were stung by a scorpion. The tone drips with sarcasm. It's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of, "I've heard every excuse and none of them impress me. Get back to work." Anyone who's ever managed a crew will recognize the frustration. These men took pride in their work. That comes through clearly in the archaeological record. They signed their names to tomb decorations sometimes. They built elaborate tombs for themselves, decorated with scenes that showed them working on royal projects. They passed down techniques and secrets within families. They competed with each other. Foremen from rival gangs would argue about whose team did better work, and they were compensated well for their expertise. Not in coins. Ancient Egypt didn't use money in the way we think of it. They were paid in rations. Grain primarily, which was the basis of the economy, but also beer, fish, vegetables, oil, meat on special occasions, and firewood. The rations were generous, enough not just to feed the worker and his family, but to leave surplus that could be traded for other goods. A typical monthly ration for a worker included about 4 to 5 sacks of grain, making roughly 400 loaves of bread or enough to brew several jugs of beer. That's more than most Egyptian families saw in a year. The foremen got double rations. The scribes and priests attached to the village got their own allocations. It was a privileged existence, materially speaking. Those who remember rationing during the war will understand the system. Everything was allocated, distributed on a schedule, and tracked meticulously. The difference is that in ancient Egypt, this was normal. The entire economy ran on redistribution of grain and goods. The Deir el-Medina workers just happened to be on the better end of that system. Now we come to one of the most remarkable events in ancient Egyptian history, and one that would be forgotten if not for the meticulous record-keeping of the Deir el-Medina scribes. In year 29 of Ramesses III, around 1156 BCE, toward the end of the New Kingdom, the workers went on strike. Let me say that again for emphasis. In ancient Egypt, 3,180 years ago, workers organized collective action and successfully forced the government to meet their demands. It's the first recorded strike in history, and it happened because someone forgot to pay the tomb builders. The background is important. Ramesses III was dealing with serious problems. The Bronze Age collapse was in full swing. The mysterious sea peoples were raiding the coasts. The Egyptian economy was struggling. The elaborate bureaucracy that normally kept everything running smoothly was breaking down. And in the chaos, someone failed to deliver the workers' monthly rations on time. This wasn't unusual at first. Rations might be a few days late sometimes. The workers would grumble, but wait. But as the delays stretched to weeks and then months, patience wore thin. These men had families to feed. They couldn't just go out and buy food in a market. Ancient Egypt didn't work that way. If the rations didn't come, they went hungry. The strike began after the rations were 20 days overdue. 20 days. These men had exhausted their reserves. They'd traded whatever surplus they had. They'd borrowed from neighbors, and still nothing came. So they did something unprecedented. They stopped working, but they didn't just stop working. They were strategic about it. They didn't simply sit at home. That would have been easy for the authorities to ignore. Instead, they marched. They walked off the job and went to the memorial temples on the West Bank, the very structures that represented royal power and religious authority. They sat down in front of these temples and announced they wouldn't leave until they were paid. The scribe who recorded this event left us a detailed account. The workers shouted, "We are hungry! 18 days have passed in this month already." They refused to be dismissed or ignored. When officials came out to negotiate, the workers stood firm. "We're not going anywhere. We're not going back to work. Pay us what we're owed." And here's what makes this so remarkable. It worked. The officials scrambled to find grain. They distributed what they could immediately, promising the rest would follow. The workers went back to the village. A few days later, when the authorities tried to stall on the full payment, the workers marched again. And again they won. The strike continued intermittently for weeks. Each time rations were delayed, the workers walked out. They refined their tactics. They picketed at different locations, temples, government offices, wherever officials might be embarrassed by their presence. They made sure their protests were visible and disruptive. and they maintained solidarity. No worker broke ranks to go back early. No one accepted partial payment and abandoned the others. This wasn't spontaneous. This was organized labor action, and it required leadership, planning, and coordination. The foremen played crucial roles. The scribes, sympathetic to the workers' cause, documented everything carefully, creating a record that implicitly supported the workers' version of events. The workers themselves maintained discipline, avoiding violence or destruction that would have given authorities an excuse for harsh crackdowns. Those who lived through the Depression or remember the labor movements of the 40s and 50s will recognize the dynamics. Management tries to wait you out. They make partial concessions, hoping you'll break. They promise the rest will come later, and the workers have to decide. Do we trust them? Do we hold out? Do we stick together? The Deir el-Medina workers stuck together, and eventually the rations came. Not just that month's allotment, but back pay for what had been missed. The strike succeeded because the workers understood something fundamental. They had leverage. The royal tombs weren't going to build themselves. The pharaoh's eternal resting place couldn't be completed without these specific skilled craftsmen. The authorities needed them more than they needed any individual official. The strike had consequences. It established a precedent that the workers could and would push back when mistreated. It showed that collective action worked, even in an authoritarian society. And it left a written record that survived 3,000 years, telling us that labor struggles aren't modern inventions. People have always understood that they deserved fair compensation for their work, and they've always been willing to fight for it. But it also revealed the fragility of the system. The strike happened during Egypt's decline, when central authority was weakening. Earlier, during the height of the New Kingdom, it's unlikely workers would have dared such action. Later, as Egypt fragmented further, there wouldn't have been anyone to strike against. The whole system would collapse. For now, though, in that specific moment, the workers of Deir el-Medina stood up for themselves and won. They weren't slaves. They weren't voiceless laborers grateful for whatever scraps the state provided. They were skilled professionals who knew their worth and demanded to be treated accordingly. Congratulations, ancient Egypt. You just learned that the people who build monuments can also organize unions. Let's talk about the actual work. What did these men do all day? How did you build a tomb in solid rock using copper tools and human muscle? The work week ran 10 days, divided into 8-day stretches of work followed by 2 days off. The men didn't live at the work sites. Each morning they'd leave Deir el-Medina before dawn and hike across the desert to the Valley of the Kings, about a 2-mile walk over rough terrain. They'd work through the day, though the Egyptian workday was divided into shifts to avoid the worst heat, and then hike back in the evening. Some men stayed at the work site during the 8-day work period, sleeping in temporary stone huts built near the tombs. These shelters weren't comfortable, just enough to get out of the sun and protect from occasional storms. Water was hauled from the Nile, a considerable effort that required dedicated water carriers making the journey repeatedly. The tomb work itself followed a specific sequence. First, the stonecutters would carve the initial corridor into the cliff face or hillside. This wasn't gentle work. It required hammering copper chisels against limestone for hours, the repetitive impact jarring through arms and shoulders, breathing air thick with stone dust, working by lamplight in confined spaces that grew hotter as you went deeper into the rock. Copper isn't hard like steel. It dulls quickly. The workers had to stop constantly to resharpen their tools, hammering the edges back into shape or replacing them entirely. The fortunate among you who remember working before power tools will appreciate what this meant. Every inch of progress required dozens of tool strikes, constant maintenance, and physical endurance. The limestone in the Valley of the Kings varied in quality. Sometimes you'd hit a layer that cut beautifully, almost like butter under a sharp tool. Other times you'd encounter a section riddled with flaws, or so hard the chisels barely made a dent. You couldn't just skip the bad sections. You had to work through them, hour after exhausting hour. As the corridors extended deeper into the rock, new problems emerged. The air grew stale. Breathing became difficult. Lamps used up oxygen and added heat. Workers had to develop rotation systems, some men cutting, others hauling out debris, still others bringing in fresh air by fanning the entrance or creating crude ventilation shafts when possible. The debris removal alone was monumental. Every chip of stone had to be carried out in baskets, hauled through increasingly long corridors, dumped outside. As tombs grew more elaborate, some extending hundreds of feet into the mountains with multiple chambers and side corridors, the simple logistics of debris removal could employ several workers full-time. Once the basic corridors and chambers were carved, the real artistry began. Plasterers would smooth the wall surfaces, filling cracks and imperfections with gypsum plaster mixed with straw and sand. This created the canvas for the draftsman, who would then sketch the entire decorative program in red ochre, covering the walls with scenes of the pharaoh's journey through the afterlife. These preliminary sketches show remarkable skill. Egyptian art followed strict conventions, the proportions of figures, the postures, the perspective, everything was standardized. But within those constraints, individual artists showed creativity and refinement. A master draftsman could sketch a scene quickly and accurately, knowing exactly how large to make each figure, how to space elements, how to maintain balance across an entire wall. After the red sketches were approved, correcting scribes would go over them in black, making adjustments to improve composition or fix errors. Only then would the sculptors take over, carving the relief images into the plaster and stone. This was painstaking work, especially for the finest quality tombs where the relief was supposed to be shallow and delicate, with multiple levels of depth creating subtle shadow effects. Finally came the painters. Grinding mineral pigments, red and yellow ochre, green malachite, blue azurite, black charcoal, white gypsum, mixing them with water and binding agents, applying them in careful layers to the carved reliefs. The colors had symbolic meanings: red for life and power, blue for the Nile and fertility, green for resurrection, yellow for gold and eternity. Every color choice mattered. Every application had to follow tradition. The painters worked in teams, each member responsible for specific colors or elements. One painter might specialize in skin tones, another in backgrounds. A master painter would add the finest details, jewelry, hieroglyphs, the expressions on faces. The work required steady hands, good eyes, and intimate knowledge of the pigments, how they mixed, how they dried, how they'd look by lamplight versus sunlight. And all of this happened underground, in spaces that grew progressively hotter, dustier, and more difficult to work in as the tomb extended deeper. The lighting was always inadequate. Oil lamps and torches provided illumination, but they also produced smoke, consumed oxygen, and created fire hazards. Workers had to be constantly careful not to knock over a lamp and set something ablaze. Those who worked construction before OSHA will understand the conditions. No safety equipment beyond basic common sense. No respirators for the stone dust. No proper ventilation. No ergonomic tools. Just men and rock, and the expectation that you'd do the job without complaining, because complaining didn't change reality. The dust got in your lungs, the repetitive motion wore down your joints, and if you were lucky, you'd live long enough to retire before the work killed you. Let's talk about money, or rather, the lack of it. Ancient Egypt didn't use coins during most of its history. The economy ran on barter and redistribution, with grain as the primary measure of value. And the workers of Deir el-Medina were paid in kind, rations distributed monthly according to rank and position. The system was sophisticated despite being based on commodities rather than currency. Each worker's monthly ration was calculated in units called sacks of grain, though the grain itself came from centralized storehouses controlled by the state. A regular worker received about 4 to 5.5 sacks per month. Foremen got double. Scribes, physicians, and priests attached to the community received their own allocations. A sack of grain could be ground into flour for bread or fermented into beer. Bread and beer were the staples of the Egyptian diet. Everything else, vegetables, fish, meat, oil, salt, clothing, tools, had to be acquired through trade, and the value of these goods was calculated in grain equivalents. So a worker earning 5 sacks of grain per month was effectively being paid in a commodity he could either consume or trade. If his family needed less than 5 sacks for food, he could trade the surplus for other necessities. If he needed more, he could borrow against future rations or work side jobs during his days off. The records show that ration distribution didn't always go smoothly. We've already discussed the strike when rations stopped entirely, but even under normal circumstances, there were constant negotiations, complaints, and adjustments. Workers argued they deserved more based on their seniority or skill. Foremen played favorites, giving better cuts to workers they liked. Scribes made errors or accepted bribes to make errors in recording distributions. The documents preserved on Ostraka include numerous receipts and accounts documenting these transactions. Received from the scribe Amenacht 3 sacks of grain and 1 jar of beer. Simple, but essential for keeping track of who got what and who still owed what. And beyond the official rations, workers engaged in a complex web of informal economic exchanges. They loaned grain to each other, traded work for goods, made deals that wouldn't show up in the official records. A worker might agree to help a neighbor repair his roof in exchange for a jar of oil. A foreman might quietly supplement a struggling worker's ration in exchange for the worker's son serving as an apprentice. Beer deserves special mention because it was nearly as important as bread in the Egyptian diet. Egyptian beer wasn't like modern beer. It was thicker, less fermented, more like liquid bread, and consumed throughout the day as a nutritious beverage. Children drank weak beer. Adults drank stronger versions. Beer was safer than water, provided calories and nutrients, and was a social lubricant that everyone from pharaohs to peasants enjoyed. The workers' rations extended beyond grain and beer. Monthly allocations included fish, dried or salted for preservation, oil for cooking and lamp fuel, firewood, which had to be transported from the Nile Valley since the desert provided no trees, vegetables when available, onions, garlic, lentils, lettuce. Meat was rarer, distributed on festival days or after successful completion of major work milestones. Clothing was issued periodically. Linen kilts for the men, dresses for the women, both in simple white fabric appropriate for Egypt's climate. Workers received sandals, though many probably went barefoot most of the time. Tools were provided by the state: copper chisels, wooden mallets, rope, baskets, though workers probably supplemented these with personal tools they made or purchased. The foreman controlled some discretionary resources and could reward good work or punish poor performance through the ration system. A worker who showed up consistently, did quality work, and didn't cause trouble might find his ration mysteriously increasing. A worker who was frequently absent or did sloppy work might find himself getting the minimum or receiving grain of poor quality that was harder to grind or had been contaminated by rats. Those who remember company stores or payment-in-kind systems will recognize the dynamic. The employer controls not just your wages, but access to necessities. It creates dependency. It makes workers vulnerable to abuse. but it also creates a direct relationship between work performance and material welfare that wage systems can obscure. The village economy also included specialist production for trade. Workers would use their days off to make items they could sell or barter. Furniture, baskets, pottery, amulets, tools, even small tombs and funerary equipment for middle-class Egyptians who couldn't afford elite artisan work but wanted something better than basic grave goods. This created a secondary economy that supplemented the official ration system. A skilled carpenter could make a quality chest in a few days and trade it for enough grain to feed his family for a month. A painter could decorate a wealthy merchant's tomb chapel on his days off and receive payment in livestock or luxury goods. The records show workers loaning goods to each other at interest. Loan to Khaim Waset, 10 loaves of bread, to be repaid as 12 loaves next month. Credit and debt, the eternal economic dance, existed in Deir el-Medina just as it does today. Some workers were good with money, or rather good with grain accounting, and accumulated surpluses. Others were perpetually in debt, borrowing to cover shortfalls, promising future labor to settle accounts. And of course, some workers supplemented their income through less legitimate means. Tomb robbery was the ultimate temptation. The workers knew exactly where treasures were buried and how to access them. Some succumbed. The legal records include trials for theft, with workers accused of stealing gold, artifacts, or even small items from tombs they were building or maintaining. Now let's talk about something the monuments never show: family life. The human relationships, the domestic routines, the ways people actually lived when they weren't carving hieroglyphs or hauling stone. Marriage in Deir el-Medina typically happened young, at least by modern standards. Girls married in their early teens, boys in their late teens or early 20s once they'd established themselves in a trade. The marriages were arranged by families, though personal preference mattered more than in many ancient societies. A young man couldn't marry someone from outside the village without special permission. The community was closed, the gene pool limited. Wedding ceremonies weren't elaborate. Marriage was essentially a legal and economic arrangement formalized through contracts that specified how property would be divided if the couple divorced. And divorce was relatively straightforward. Either party could initiate it. The woman would take her dowry and personal property. The man would keep the house and most joint acquisitions. Children typically stayed with the father, though exceptions existed. The Ostraka preserve numerous divorce documents, and they're remarkably matter-of-fact. I divorce you. I will not seek you out. You may marry another. No moralizing, no complicated proceedings, just a statement of fact that the marriage was ending. But that legal simplicity doesn't mean marriages were emotionless. Love letters written on ostraka show genuine affection between spouses. My heart is sick for you. I cannot work thinking of your sweet face. Poetry, romantic gestures, expressions of longing when couples were separated. All of this appears in the written record. Children were central to family life, as they were in most ancient societies. Large families were common, though infant and child mortality was high enough that maybe half of all children didn't survive to adulthood. Parents who successfully raised 4 or 5 children to maturity were fortunate. The Ostraka include what we might call report cards, records of children's progress in learning to read and write or in mastering craft skills. The boy shows promise with the chisel. This child cannot concentrate and wastes his master's time. Parents worried about their children's education and futures just as parents always have. Children were put to work young, though the work was age-appropriate. Small children ran errands, carried water, helped with domestic tasks. By age 7 or 8, boys were apprenticing in their father's trades, learning to handle tools and materials. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers, grinding grain, making bread, weaving, managing household resources. But childhood in ancient Egypt was short. By early adolescence, children were expected to contribute meaningfully to household economy, and by their mid-teens, they were marrying and starting families of their own. Women's roles in Deir el-Medina were constrained by the standards of ancient societies, but they had more freedom and legal standing than women in many other civilizations. Women could own property. They could initiate divorce. They could participate in economic transactions. They could bring legal cases. The archaeological record shows women running businesses, lending money, inheriting property, and managing significant resources. I found that one woman, Naunacht, left a will disinheriting several of her children who had neglected her in her old age, while leaving everything to the children who had cared for her. The document is remarkable for its emotional honesty. They didn't give me water when I was thirsty. They didn't clothe me when I was cold. Let them have nothing from me. Women typically didn't work in the tombs, but they managed the complex domestic economy that made the village function. Grinding grain was women's work, and it was brutal, exhausting labor that had to be done daily. Making bread and beer required skill and constant attention. Maintaining clothing in the harsh conditions, the desert dust, the sun that bleached and rotted fabric, the wear from constant use, demanded continuous effort. Women also participated in the village's legal and economic life. They appear in court cases as plaintiffs and witnesses. They owned property and passed it to their daughters. They made business deals and loans. They weren't equal to men in status, but they weren't chattel either. The documents reveal family dynamics that feel remarkably modern. Arguments over inheritance, disputes between siblings, mothers-in-law causing trouble, husbands complaining their wives spent too much, wives complaining their husbands drank too much, the basic human dramas of family life that transcend culture and time. One particularly revealing document is a letter from a man to his deceased wife. Apparently, he believed she was haunting him from the afterlife, causing him illness and misfortune. In the letter, he defends himself. "What have I done to you? When you were sick, I brought physicians. When you died, I mourned properly. I gave you a fine burial. Now you torment me. Why?" It's simultaneously strange and completely relatable. A grieving widower convinced his wife is still angry with him, trying to clear his conscience even in death. Those who've been married know the dynamic. No matter how much you love someone, living together creates friction. Add the stresses of a hard life in a harsh environment, the proximity of neighbors who hear everything, and the lack of privacy, and it's remarkable families functioned as well as they did. Living in a village of 300 people where everyone knew everyone's business created a unique social dynamic. Privacy was nearly impossible. The walls were thin, the houses were close, conversations carried, and the village culture included a robust gossip network that would put modern social media to shame. The Ostraka preserve evidence of this. Complaints about neighbors, accusations of affairs, rumors about who was stealing from whom, commentary on who was lazy, who was skilled, who was trustworthy, who wasn't. The workers knew everything about each other's lives, their financial situations, their family problems, their work performance, their personal habits. This created both solidarity and tension. On one hand, the close-knit community meant that people supported each other during hardship. When someone was sick, neighbors helped. When someone died, the community mourned together. When workers struck, they stuck together. The isolation that could have made them vulnerable instead created bonds. On the other hand, living that close meant conflicts festered. Petty grievances escalated. People held grudges for years. The legal record showcases where neighbors sued each other over borrowed tools never returned, or property boundaries, or insults shouted during arguments, or 1,000 other small violations of social norms. The community had mechanisms for dealing with disputes. An informal court met regularly to hear cases and render judgments. The court consisted of respected community members, senior foremen, scribes, elders, who would listen to both sides and make decisions. Their judgments had the weight of social pressure, if not legal enforcement. Many cases involved property. Someone's wall collapsed onto their neighbor's house. Who pays for repairs? Someone diverted water meant for the communal well. How should they be punished? Someone's donkey ate someone else's garden vegetables. What compensation is owed? But other cases touched on personal matters, accusations of adultery, disputes over inheritances, slander cases where someone's reputation had been damaged by gossip, theft accusations that could ruin a worker's career if proven true. The community valued its skilled workers and tried to resolve disputes without destroying livelihoods. Punishments often involved compensation rather than harsh penalties. Pay back what you stole, rebuild what you damaged, publicly apologize for insults. The goal was restoring social harmony, not vengeance. Festivals and religious celebrations provided regular breaks from the routine and opportunities for community bonding. Ancient Egypt had numerous religious holidays throughout the year. On these days, work stopped, rations were supplemented with special foods, and the village gathered for feasts and rituals. Religion permeated daily life. Each house had a small shrine for family gods. Bes, the dwarf god who protected children. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. Hathor, goddess of love and joy. Workers prayed for protection, for healthy children, for good harvests, for success in their work. But the villagers also had their own patron deities connected to their profession. Ptah, the craftsman god. Thoth, god of writing and knowledge. These gods were part of the worker's professional identity. A painter might pray to Thoth before starting work on difficult hieroglyphs. A sculptor might make offerings to Ptah after successfully completing a challenging relief. The village had its own chapels and priests, though the priests were part-time, workers who served in religious roles in addition to their craft work. Funerals were community events. When someone died, the village gathered, the priests performed rituals, and the deceased was buried in the community cemetery on the hillside above the village. Those tombs the workers built for themselves are fascinating. They're smaller than royal tombs, obviously, but they're decorated with skill and care. The scenes show the deceased at work, the deceased with family, the deceased making offerings to gods. These men built eternity for pharaohs, and they built their own modest versions of that eternity for themselves and their families. The community also had leisure activities. Evidence suggests they played board games, Senet, a popular Egyptian game similar to backgammon. They told stories around fires in the evening. They made music. Simple instruments like flutes, drums, and lyres appear in the archaeological record. And they drank. Beer was consumed daily, but feast days meant stronger beer and more of it. Drunkenness was tolerated, even expected, on major celebrations. The moral framework didn't condemn enjoying yourself, though chronic drunkenness that interfered with work would bring social sanctions. The social fabric of Deir el-Medina was complex, woven from threads of mutual dependence, shared profession, common hardships, family connections, and the simple human need for community. These weren't isolated individuals grinding through existence. They were a community with all the support, conflict, joy, and frustration that implies. Your generation understands tight-knit communities better than most. You remember neighborhoods where everyone knew each other, where front doors stayed unlocked, where raising children was a collective effort. That sense of community comes with trade-offs: lack of privacy, social pressure to conform, everyone in your business. But it also provides support and belonging that modern, anonymous life often lacks. Deir el-Medina was that kind of community, for better and worse. And the archaeological record suggests that for most residents, most of the time, it was better than worse. One of the most remarkable aspects of Deir el-Medina is the literacy level. As we've mentioned, these were working men, not nobles or professional scribes, and yet many could read and write, at least enough to handle the practical documents their work required. This wasn't universal literacy. Some workers never learned to read. Others could read, but not write well. But the overall literacy rate was extraordinary for ancient Egypt, where reading and writing were elite skills that most people never acquired. How did they learn? The village had no formal school in the modern sense. Education was apprenticeship-based and largely practical. Boys learned to read and write from their fathers, from village scribes, or from elder craftsmen who had mastered the skill. The ostraca include what appear to be lesson texts, standard phrases and letters that students would copy over and over to practice forming the signs. Egyptian had two main writing systems. Hieroglyphics, the formal carved script used on monuments and in religious texts, was complex and time-consuming. For everyday use, Egyptians used hieratic, a cursive script that could be written quickly with a reed pen on papyrus or ostraca. The workers needed to read architectural plans, work orders, ration records, and legal documents. They needed to write receipts, letters, complaints, and personal notes. This wasn't reading literature or religious philosophy. It was functional literacy for practical purposes. But some workers went beyond functional literacy. The ostraca include copies of literary works, stories, poems, wisdom literature. Some workers clearly read for pleasure or personal enrichment, copying texts they found interesting or meaningful. One ostracon contains a portion of the Tale of Sinuhe, one of ancient Egypt's great literary works. Why would a tomb worker copy this story? For the same reason anyone reads literature: entertainment, reflection, connection to culture and tradition. The evidence suggests that education was valued in the community. Parents wanted their sons to learn to read because it improved career prospects. A literate worker could aspire to become a scribe, a foreman, or take on administrative roles that paid better and were less physically demanding than hauling stone. The best students might even leave the village for advanced training. Some workers' sons became professional scribes serving in temples or government offices. This wasn't common, but it was possible, representing a path to upward mobility that was rare in ancient Egypt's rigid social structure. Learning a craft was equally important. Boys apprenticed to their fathers or to master craftsmen, learning through observation and practice. A young sculptor would spend years watching his master work, gradually taking on more complex tasks as his skill developed. First he'd prepare materials, then he'd work on rough shaping. Eventually, he'd be trusted with finer details. Finally, if he showed exceptional talent, he might develop his own style and reputation. The workshops themselves were schools. Master craftsmen passed down techniques that had evolved over generations: how to mix plaster so it dried smoothly, which chisels worked best on which stone, how to grind pigments to achieve specific colors, where to strike stone to split it cleanly versus where to strike for controlled removal. This knowledge wasn't written down systematically. It was embodied in practice, demonstrated by example, refined through trial and error, and transmitted person to person. A master craftsman carried in his hands and mind the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Egyptian stonework. The workers took pride in this expertise. They weren't just laborers following orders. They were skilled professionals who understood their craft deeply. A good sculptor could look at a wall and visualize the finished relief. A master painter knew how colors would interact and age. A foreman could estimate how long a project would take and what resources it would require. Those who learned trades through apprenticeship, whether as mechanics, carpenters, plumbers, or any other skilled work, understand this kind of knowledge. It can't be fully captured in textbooks or manuals. It requires hands-on experience, guidance from someone who's mastered the craft, and years of practice making mistakes and learning from them. The Deir el-Medina workers were the inheritors and guardians of ancient Egypt's artistic and architectural traditions. They kept that knowledge alive across generations, adapting it to new challenges while maintaining the essential techniques that made Egyptian art and architecture distinctive. Now we need to talk about the costs of the work. Building tombs wasn't safe, and it definitely wasn't healthy. The workers paid for their craft with their bodies. Start with the stone dust. Every day, workers breathed in fine particles of limestone, sandstone, and plaster. This dust accumulated in their lungs, causing respiratory problems that worsened over years of exposure. We see evidence of this in the skeletal remains from the cemetery. Lung disease, chronic coughs, breathing difficulties. Then there were the injuries. Chisels slipped and cut hands. Mallets missed their mark and smashed fingers. Stone blocks fell on feet. Workers strained backs hauling heavy loads. Repetitive motion from years of the same hammering movements caused joint damage. Arthritis was common among older workers. The working conditions contributed to health problems. The heat in the tombs was oppressive. Workers became dehydrated despite drinking water regularly. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke were risks, especially during summer. The poor lighting led to eye strain and accidents. Workers stumbled in the dim lamplight, fell down shafts, or walked into walls. And then there were the usual diseases of pre-modern life. Gastrointestinal parasites from contaminated water or food. Malaria from mosquitoes breeding near the Nile. Bacterial infections from minor cuts that turned serious. Dental problems from grit in the grain that wore down teeth. The village had physicians. These weren't highly trained specialists. Ancient Egyptian medical knowledge was impressive in some ways, but limited by lack of understanding about infection, anatomy, and disease transmission. Still, the village doctors did what they could. They set broken bones. Splints and casts made from wood and linen could immobilize fractures while they healed. They stitched wounds with bronze needles and linen thread. They applied poultices and ointments to injuries and infections. Honey, which has natural antibacterial properties, was used on wounds. Various herbal remedies treated different ailments. The medical papyri that survive from ancient Egypt describe treatments for numerous conditions. Some are reasonable, using willow bark for pain relief, which contains a compound similar to aspirin. Others are less scientific, magical incantations to ward off disease, amulets to protect against evil spirits. The workers probably employed a mix of practical medicine and magical thinking. When someone was sick, you tried honey and herbs. You also prayed to the gods and wore protective amulets. You hedged your bets because when you don't understand what causes disease, you try everything that might help. Occupational hazards specific to tomb work included one we've already mentioned, the risk of being accused of tomb robbery. The temptation was always there. You're working in a chamber, being filled with gold, jewelry, precious objects. You know exactly where everything is and how to access it. The pharaoh's dead. He won't miss a small amulet or two, right? Wrong. Tomb robbery was treated as one of the most serious crimes in ancient Egypt. It violated sacred space, threatened the afterlife of the deceased, and, most importantly to the authorities, stole state property. Workers caught robbing tombs faced severe punishment, beatings, mutilation, even execution. The legal records include tomb robbery trials. Workers interrogated, sometimes tortured to extract confessions. The testimony describes how robberies were planned and executed. Groups of workers would coordinate, breaking into sealed tombs during their days off, removing valuables, fencing them through corrupt officials or traders. Some got away with it for years. Others were caught and made examples of. The authorities wanted workers to understand that the wages they earned, generous though they were, didn't justify the risk of theft. But beyond these dramatic crimes, most workers simply lived with the gradual deterioration that hard physical labor causes. Your back hurt from years of bending over work. Your knees ached from kneeling on stone floors. Your hands grew stiff from gripping tools. You developed a persistent cough from the dust. Your eyes weakened from working by poor light. If you were lucky, you lived long enough to retire, to become an elder who supervised and advised rather than working with tools. The foreman positions sometimes went to men who could no longer do the physical work, but whose experience and knowledge remained valuable. If you weren't lucky, the work killed you before old age. The cemetery contains many men who died in their 30s and 40s, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard labor. For them, building eternity for pharaohs meant sacrificing their own chance at a long life. Those who worked dangerous jobs, who remember colleagues who died or were permanently disabled from workplace injuries, understand that the monuments we admire were built at real human cost. Every statue, every carved relief, every perfectly cut stone represents hours of someone's life spent in difficult, dangerous conditions. The workers of Deir el-Medina knew this. They weren't naive about the risks. But they took the jobs anyway, because the alternatives were worse. A peasant farmer's life was even harder in many ways. Endless agricultural labor in the brutal sun, with none of the privileges the tomb workers enjoyed. At least in Deir el-Medina, you had steady rations, some social status, and the satisfaction of creating work that would last forever. All things end. Even communities that lasted centuries eventually fade away. For Deir el-Medina, the end came gradually during the late 20th and early 21st dynasties, roughly 1100 to 1050 BCE. The reasons were complex and interconnected. Egypt was declining as a major power. The Bronze Age collapse had disrupted trade networks, the economy struggled, the central government weakened, and critically for Deir el-Medina, pharaohs stopped building elaborate tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Why build a grand tomb when your kingdom was contracting and resources were scarce? Why invest in your eternal home when you couldn't maintain your earthly kingdom? The later New Kingdom pharaohs built simpler tombs or were buried in cheaper locations, or sometimes shared tombs with family members. This meant less work for the Deir el-Medina craftsmen. Projects became smaller, the workforce was reduced, rations came less reliably. We've already discussed the strike that happened during Ramesses III's reign. As Egypt's problems worsened, conditions in the village deteriorated. Some workers left, finding work elsewhere or returning to agricultural life in the Nile Valley. Others stayed, trying to maintain the community and hoping for better times. The village shrank. Houses were abandoned, social structures frayed. The final blow came during the civil conflicts and foreign invasions that marked the end of the New Kingdom. Thebes, the great capital across the river, was sacked multiple times. The Valley of the Kings became a target for tomb robbers, and the very workers who had built the tombs were sometimes suspected of being complicit in the robberies. By around 1050 BCE, Deir el-Medina was largely abandoned. A few families might have lingered, but the community that had existed for nearly 500 years was gone. The houses fell into ruin. Sand drifted through the empty streets. The chapels and tombs on the hillside stood silent. For 3,000 years, the village remained largely undisturbed. Occasionally, people passed through. In Ptolemaic and Roman times, some structures were briefly reoccupied. But the Deir el-Medina of the New Kingdom tomb workers was finished. What remained were the ruins and, critically, the written records. Those thousands of ostraka and papyri, abandoned when the village was evacuated, survived in the dry desert climate. They waited for archaeologists to discover them, and through careful study, resurrect the lives of the people who had written them. The workers' descendants scattered across Egypt. Some probably continued in craft trades, others returned to farming. A few might have joined the priesthood or military. The skills and knowledge passed down through generations were gradually lost as the context that had sustained them disappeared. But the tombs they built survived. The reliefs they carved remained. The paintings they applied still glowed with color when archaeologists entered sealed chambers. The work of the Deir el-Medina craftsmen outlasted their community, outlasted their civilization, outlasted their entire world. Those who've seen industries disappear, mining towns become ghost towns, factories close and communities scatter, understand how this happens. When the economic basis for a community vanishes, the community follows. People adapt, move, find new work, life goes on. But something is lost, something that can never be perfectly recreated. For Deir el-Medina, what was lost was a unique community of skilled artisans who had developed, over centuries, an extraordinary craft culture and a rich social world. When the tomb stopped being built, that world ended. Here's the irony that makes Deir el-Medina so valuable to historians. We don't have this level of detail about pharaohs. We don't know what Ramesses II wrote to his wife when he was away on campaign. We don't have Tutankhamun's shopping lists or Hatshepsut's personal correspondence with her mother. What we have is propaganda. Monumental inscriptions praising the king's victories. Religious texts affirming the king's divinity. Formal records of donations to temples, the official version of events, carefully crafted to present the ruler in the best possible light. But for the workers of Deir el-Medina, we have their actual lives, documented in careless detail because no one thought to destroy or censor the trash they left behind. We have shopping lists, divorce papers, complaints about lazy neighbors, love letters, medical prescriptions, legal disputes over garden boundaries. This mundane material is historically priceless. It tells us how ordinary people actually lived in ancient Egypt, not how they were supposed to live according to religious texts or philosophical treatises, but how they really lived, with all the mess, compromise, conflict, and humanity that entails. The Ostraka reveal that people 3,000 years ago worried about the same things people worry about today: money, health, family, work, reputation, justice, love. The specifics change. They worried about grain rations instead of paychecks, about tomb robbers instead of identity theft. But the fundamental human concerns remain constant. They loved their children and worried about their futures. They complained when bosses were unfair. They gossiped about neighbors. They tried to make ends meet on limited resources. They dreamed of better lives. They grieved when loved ones died. They celebrated when good things happened. Reading their words, even through translation, even across 3 millennia, you recognize them. These aren't alien beings from a strange civilization. They're people, just people, living lives that were different in detail, but fundamentally similar in their human concerns. The archaeologist Bernard Bruyère, who excavated Deir el-Medina starting in the 1920s, initially focused on the tombs and chapels. But as he and his team uncovered more and more ostraka, the focus shifted. The written material became the main attraction, the primary source of value from the site. Other scholars joined the effort. The hieratic script had to be translated. The documents had to be catalogued, analyzed, cross-referenced. Individual texts had to be placed in context. When was this written? By whom? In response to what situation? The work continues today, Thousands of ostraka remain unstudied in museum collections. New techniques, digital imaging, computer-aided translation, database analysis allow scholars to extract more information from texts that have been known for decades. What these texts have taught us extends beyond just Deir el-Medina. They've changed our understanding of ancient Egyptian society more broadly. They've shown that life in ancient Egypt was more complex, more varied, more human than the monumental record suggests. They've revealed that women had more legal rights than previously thought, that workers could organize and protest, that literacy was more widespread among non-elite populations, that religious belief was more personal and less doctrinaire than formal temple texts suggest, that economic life was more dynamic and market-oriented than the redistributive model implies. In short, the garbage of Deir el-Medina has proven more informative than the monuments of the pharaohs. The notes that people threw away matter more to historians than the inscriptions they meant to preserve forever. There's a lesson in that, about what we choose to remember and what we think is important. The workers didn't know they were creating historical records. They were just living their lives and writing things down because literacy was useful. But their casual record-keeping has given us a window into ancient Egypt that we have for almost no other ancient civilization. If you've ever wondered whether the everyday details of your life matter, whether the small struggles and joys are significant, the answer from Deir el-Medina is yes. The mundane is what reveals us. The everyday is what survives. The small human dramas matter more than the grand narratives because they're true to the experience of living. So, what's the legacy of Deir el-Medina? What do these workers leave us, beyond the tombs they carved and the ostraka they abandoned? First, they leave us a human face for ancient Egypt. Too often, ancient civilizations are presented as alien. They're people fundamentally different from us. The pharaohs become distant god-kings. The culture becomes a list of strange beliefs and practices. The society becomes a system of rules and hierarchies. But Deir el-Medina reminds us that ancient Egyptians were people. They got angry when their wages were late. They gossiped about their neighbors, they loved their children, they complained about their mothers-in-law. They argued over property boundaries. They went on strike when treated unfairly. This humanization is valuable. It helps us understand that human nature doesn't fundamentally change across time and culture. The specific circumstances differ. We use money instead of grain, live in different types of houses, believe different things about the afterlife. But the underlying human experiences remain constant. Second, they leave us evidence that skilled labor has always had value and that workers have always understood their worth. The Deir el-Medina strike wasn't an aberration. It was a natural result of people recognizing that they had leverage because they possessed skills and knowledge that couldn't be easily replaced. This has implications for how we think about labor throughout history. The narrative that workers were voiceless and powerless until modern labor movements is incomplete. Workers have always found ways to resist, to organize, to demand better conditions when possible. The specific tactics and outcomes varied, but the impulse to fight for fair treatment is timeless. Third, they leave us an example of how specialized communities function. Deir el-Medina was a company town, essentially. Everyone worked in the same industry. Everyone depended on the same employer. The community was isolated and closed. This created both benefits: strong social bonds, shared purpose, mutual support, and drawbacks: lack of privacy, social pressure to conform, vulnerability when the industry declined. Studying Deir el-Medina helps us understand similar communities throughout history and today. Fourth, they leave us a reminder that great achievements come at human cost. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings are architectural and artistic marvels. They're UNESCO World Heritage Sites. They attract millions of tourists. They represent the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian culture. But they were built by real people doing hard, dangerous work. People who breathed stone dust and damaged their lungs, who suffered injuries and disabilities, who spent their lives in confined spaces by inadequate light, who created beauty and permanence at the cost of their own comfort and sometimes their health. This doesn't diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes it more impressive. These weren't anonymous builders. They were individuals with names, families, dreams, and complaints. They chose to do this work despite its difficulties, and they did it remarkably well. Fifth, they leave us evidence of gender dynamics in an ancient society. The Deir el-Medina records show women who owned property, initiated divorce, participated in economic transactions, and brought legal cases. They weren't equal to men in all respects, but they had rights and agency that might surprise those who assume ancient women were universally oppressed. This nuance is important. History isn't a simple story of progress from bad old days to enlightened present. Different societies at different times offered different opportunities and constraints. Understanding this complexity helps us think more carefully about gender, power, and social organization. Sixth, they leave us a complete archaeological site that can continue yielding information. Unlike many ancient sites that were looted, built over, or destroyed, Deir el-Medina remains largely intact. New excavations continue. New technologies allow archaeologists to extract information that earlier scholars missed. The site is a living laboratory for understanding ancient life. Every new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. Every newly translated ostrakon provides another window into the workers' world. Finally, they leave us their tombs, not the royal tombs they built, though those are part of their legacy too, but their own tombs on the hillside above the village. These modest structures show that the workers built for themselves the same kind of eternal homes they built for pharaohs, just smaller and simpler. The decoration in these workers' tombs is often personal and touching. They show themselves at work, creating the royal tombs. They show family members together. They show offerings to gods and hopes for the afterlife. In death, as in life, they were craftsmen who took pride in their work and cared about doing it well. These tombs weren't robbed as systematically as the royal tombs, perhaps because they contained little of material value. But they contained something more important: evidence of how these people saw themselves and what they hoped for. They hoped to be remembered. They hoped their work would matter. They hoped the afterlife would be kind to them. They hoped, just as humans always hope, that their lives meant something beyond the daily struggle to survive. And in a way, their hopes were fulfilled. We remember them, not by name mostly, though some names survive in the records, but collectively. We remember them as the people who built the tombs, who went on strike, who loved and argued and worked and hoped. Their work did matter. The tombs they built became some of humanity's greatest archaeological treasures. The records they left became invaluable historical sources. Their lives meant something because they lived them fully, with all the messy humanity that entails. Next time you see photographs of the Valley of the Kings, or read about ancient Egypt's magnificent tombs, I want you to remember Deir el-Medina. Remember that behind every carved hieroglyph, someone's hand held the chisel. Behind every painted scene, someone mixed the pigments and applied the colors by lamplight. Remember that these builders went on strike when their wages were late, just like workers today. They complained about their bosses, argued with their spouses, worried about their children's futures. They took pride in their work, even as it wore down their bodies. Remember that history isn't just kings and battles and dates. It's people living lives, getting up each morning, doing work that needs doing, navigating relationships, dealing with problems, hoping for better days. The workers of Deir el-Medina weren't special in the sense of being fundamentally different from any other workers. They were special because we happen to have extensive records of their lives, giving us a window into ancient working-class existence that we rarely get. But their experiences, the struggles, the satisfactions, the conflicts, the compromises, weren't unique to them. Workers throughout history have faced similar challenges. The specifics change, but the fundamental human experience of working for a living, trying to make ends meet, seeking dignity and fair treatment, those things remain constant. Those who've worked with their hands, who've built things that lasted, who've taken pride in skilled work well done. You understand what the Deir el-Medina workers felt. The satisfaction of seeing a project completed. The frustration when circumstances interfered with good work. The camaraderie of colleagues who understood the craft. The exhaustion at day's end. The pride in knowing you made something meaningful. Your generation built a lot. Infrastructure that still stands, systems that still function, skills and knowledge passed down to those who came after. You understand building for permanence, doing things right, taking responsibility for quality work. The Deir el-Medina workers were your counterparts across 3,000 years. Different tools, different context, but the same fundamental commitment to craft and quality. They would have recognized you, and you would have recognized them. And in that recognition lies something important. Human nature doesn't fundamentally change. We're separated from ancient Egypt by millennia, by vastly different technologies and beliefs and social structures. But we're connected by shared human experiences, work, family, community, the struggle to make a living, the hope for something better. The monuments endure, and they're impressive. But the human stories matter more. The workers who built the tombs are more interesting than the pharaohs buried in them, because the workers left us the truth of their lives, not carefully crafted propaganda. Their truth is one of endurance, skill, community, conflict, love, hardship, and hope. It's a truth that resonates across time, because it's the truth of being human. If tonight's journey through Deir el-Medina resonated with you, whether you recognize the labor struggles, the community dynamics, or simply appreciated the human detail beneath the grand history, I'd be honored if you shared your thoughts below. Your generation's perspective on work, craft, and community adds valuable context to these ancient stories. Those who remember skilled trades and tight-knit communities bring unique insight to understanding how these workers lived. Now rest well, knowing that the work we do, the communities we build, and the lives we live matter more than we sometimes think. The Deir el-Medina workers didn't know they'd be studied 3,000 years later. They were just living their lives. But those lives, documented in their own words on discarded scraps, taught us more about ancient Egypt than all the pharaohs' monuments combined. The past may be silent, but it is never truly gone. The workers still speak to us, if we're willing to listen. And in their voices, we hear our own humanity reflected back across the centuries.